The moment this broke, it changed the entire direction of the Iran nuclear story, and almost no one is explaining why. Early this morning, reports confirmed that Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi landed in St. Petersburg for a high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. Within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made something very clear. Russia's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium is still on the table. Not a rumor, not speculation, a standing active proposal. And then came the line that should stop you in your tracks. It has not been acted upon. Four simple words, but they reveal a massive geopolitical standoff that most people are completely missing, because here's what's really happening beneath the surface. For months, the United States has repeated one core demand in every negotiation, every back-channel conversation, every diplomatic signal. Iran must get rid of its enriched uranium, not reduce it, not pause it, remove it. We're talking about roughly 450 kilo enriched to 60%, material that can be pushed to weapons grade in a matter of weeks. That's enough for multiple nuclear weapons. This isn't just another condition on a long list. This is the condition. Every ceasefire discussion, every round of indirect talks, every political message ultimately circles back to this single non-negotiable requirement. And now, out of nowhere, Russia steps in with a solution that on paper solves everything. Moscow is essentially saying, give us the uranium. We'll take it out of Iran. We'll store it on Russian soil. We'll reprocess it under international supervision. Iran keeps its nuclear infrastructure. The dangerous material leaves the country. The global community, including watchdogs like the International Atomic Energy Agency, can monitor the entire process. No war, no strikes, no escalation, a diplomatic off-ramp that avoids a global crisis. But here's the twist, the part no one can ignore. This deal, the one that checks every major box, was rejected, and that raises the real question driving this entire video. If a solution exists that prevents conflict, satisfies the core demand, and stabilizes the region, why was it turned down? Let me say this as clearly as possible, because most of the media coverage is dancing around it instead of stating it directly. Donald Trump rejected Vladimir Putin's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium. This isn't speculation. This was confirmed by Axios, where a U.S. official said plainly, it hasn't been accepted. Now, on the surface, Washington's position sounds reasonable. They keep repeating, we need to see the uranium secured, but that phrase hides the real conflict. The United States agrees with the goal, but rejects the method. They want the uranium out of Iran, just not in Russian hands. And that distinction, small on paper, massive in reality, is the entire story unfolding right now. Because look at what happens next. While Washington hesitates, Abbas Araghchi boards a plane and flies straight to St. Petersburg to sit down with Putin. That is not a routine diplomatic visit. That is a signal. Iran is effectively responding. If America won't accept Russia as the solution, we will talk to Russia directly anyway. And to really understand why this moment matters, you have to go back not months, but years to the foundation of this entire issue. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal that Trump withdrew from in 2018, Russia was already playing this exact role. Iran shipped out roughly 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile. And where did it go? To Russia. It was handled by Rosatom, stored, processed, and monitored under international oversight. And here's the key point. This system worked. There were no major violations, no diversion of material, no breakdown in oversight. The International Atomic Energy Agency verified compliance for 3 years. The arrangement functioned exactly as designed until the U.S. walked away and reimposed sanctions. So when Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says today that Russia is the only country with positive experience handling Iran's uranium, he's not promoting Russia. He's stating a documented fact. This isn't a theoretical proposal. It's a replay of a system that already succeeded. Russia has the infrastructure, the legal framework, the storage capability, and the working relationship with the IAEA to execute this again almost immediately. Even officials connected to Rosatom have said the transfer is technically feasible even under difficult conditions. And experts point out that coordination mechanisms to safely move and monitor the material already exist. So technically, diplomatically, and historically, The solution is sitting right there. Russia is ready. Iran is engaging. The IAEA can supervise. Everything lines up. Which brings us to the real question, the uncomfortable one that most Western coverage avoids. Why reject it? The answer has less to do with uranium and more to do with power. Washington's concern, based on reporting, is that allowing Russia to take and process Iran's uranium would elevate Moscow's position in the global nuclear energy market. Russia, through Rosatom, already controls a significant share of global uranium enrichment and nuclear fuel supply. If it takes Iran's stockpile, processes it, and potentially reintroduces it into the global fuel market, that strengthens Russia's leverage across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has spent years trying to reduce dependence on Russian nuclear services, that's a strategic loss. And to be fair, that concern is not irrational. It's a coherent geopolitical calculation. But here's the cost of that decision, and it's a serious one. By rejecting Russia as the custodian, the U.S. is effectively demanding that Iran give up its uranium through a channel that does not benefit Russia. The problem, those alternative channels barely exist. In reality, Iran is extremely unlikely to hand over its uranium directly to the United States. It is just as unlikely to trust U.S. allies like France or Japan with that material. And the idea of destroying the uranium inside Iran would require a level of cooperation and trust that simply isn't there. So what you're left with is a paradox. The US wants the uranium gone. Russia offers a proven way to remove it. Iran is willing to talk about it. But because of who controls the solution, not what the solution achieves, the deal stalls. And that is exactly why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters far more than it appears on the surface. So where does that leave the United States right now? In a position that's far more constrained than it appears on the surface. By rejecting Vladimir Putin's uranium proposal, Washington has effectively boxed itself into a corner. The only mechanism on the table that has actually worked before, the only one with a proven track record, has already been dismissed. And while American officials search for an alternative that doesn't currently exist, one critical fact remains unchanged. Iran's enriched uranium stays inside Iran. That means the pressure campaign continues. Instability in global energy markets persists. Oil prices remain elevated and the broader conflict drags on without a clear off-ramp. Now look at Abbas Araki's move today in that context. His flight to St. Petersburg is not just diplomacy, it's strategy. Iran understands exactly the position the U.S. has put itself in. Tran knows Washington rejected the Russian mechanism. It knows there is no ready substitute. And most importantly, it knows that without resolving the uranium issue, the United States cannot bring this crisis to an end on its own terms. So instead of waiting, Iran is leaning into the one channel that still exists, Russia. And then Araki adds another layer to this when he speaks to Iranian state media. He describes the visit as a good opportunity for consultations with Moscow and emphasizes that these discussions are especially important at this stage. That phrase is doing a lot of work. At this stage signals urgency, timing, and leverage. It tells you this is not routine coordination. It's a moment where the balance of influence is shifting. Talks are stalled, Washington is hesitating, and the uranium question remains unresolved. In that vacuum, Russia's role doesn't shrink, it expands. Why? Because as Dmitry Peskov confirmed, the offer is still there. The mechanism exists, and by physically showing up in Russia, Iran is sending a message without saying it outright. The solution is available, it's operational, and it's waiting, but the United States chose not to use it. At the same time, Iran is making sure that if Washington eventually changes its position, or if pressure mounts from global markets and allies dependent on stability and choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure for a deal is already in place and ready to move. Now add China to this equation, because what Beijing is not saying today is just as important as what Moscow is saying. Before Arachi even boarded his flight, he spoke with Wang Yi. That call happened before consultations with several regional players, which tells you something about priority and alignment. China had early visibility into Iran's thinking before others, and potentially before key developments became public. And yet today, China has remained completely silent. No statements about the visit, no reaction to the uranium proposal, no public positioning at all. But that silence should not be mistaken for absence. China's relationship with Iran's strategic programs runs deep. There are multiple intelligence assessments pointing to Chinese components in Iran's missile systems, and Iran's military technology ecosystem has long relied on both Russian and Chinese inputs. Just days ago, China and Russia held discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency, specifically about Iran's nuclear program. That meeting happened on April 24th, just 3 days before Iraqi arrives in St. Petersburg. That sequence is not random. It suggests coordination, planning, alignment before action. So what you're seeing is a layered process. The IAEA meeting acts as a coordination phase. Today's meeting in Russia looks more like an execution phase. And China is observing from a position of quiet strength. The country that has already secured long-term energy ties with Iran and has the economic leverage to shape outcomes without making noise. Which brings us back to the structural problem facing the United States. It's not just a diplomatic disagreement. It's a strategic dilemma. Washington needs Iran's uranium removed. Russia has the capability and the experience to remove it. The US rejected that pathway, and right now there is no viable alternative that Iran would accept. That leaves only two real options: eventually reconsider the Russian mechanism or pursue a far riskier route involving direct intervention. There have been discussions confirmed in reporting about the possibility of special operations forces securing nuclear material inside Iran. But think about what that actually means. That's not a diplomatic solution. That's a military escalation. It would likely violate any ceasefire framework, require extremely complex coordination, and almost certainly trigger a response from Tehran that could expand the conflict in unpredictable ways. It's a scenario filled with variables that no one can fully control. So this is the reality at this moment. As Arachi sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg, the only peaceful solution to remove Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and rejected by the United States. The only alternative involves force with all the risks that come with it. And meanwhile, the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. Maritime tensions rise, economic pressure builds, and the diplomatic window that was supposed to open during a ceasefire is slowly closing. Now, here's where the situation becomes almost impossible to ignore. Donald Trump himself said that the uranium issue is 99% of the deal. That's not an interpretation, that's his framing. J.D. Vance echoed the same idea. So if the uranium question represents nearly the entire agreement and the only workable mechanism to resolve it has already been rejected, then what you're really looking at is this. The United States has effectively blocked 99% of its own pathway to a deal. That's not a minor diplomatic setback. That's the core of the entire process. And that is exactly why Abbasi is sitting in St. Petersburg with Vladimir Putin right now. This meeting is not about deciding whether Russia will take the uranium. That part has already been signaled. It's about the fine print, the timeline, the verification structure with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the technical safeguards, and most importantly, the guarantees that Russia cannot simply turn around and leverage that material to expand its dominance in the global nuclear fuel market. And here's the key insight. Those are solvable problems. These are not existential geopolitical barriers. They are engineering, legal, and regulatory questions. They can be negotiated, structured, and enforced. And Iran is in Russia right now precisely because the bigger strategic question is already settled. Russia is willing. Iran is open to it. The IAEA can oversee it. The only missing piece in this equation is a yes from Washington. Now, to be fair, there is a counter argument, and it deserves to be addressed directly. The concern is that Russia is not acting out of goodwill. Vladimir Putin is not offering to take Iran's uranium as a favor to the international community. He's doing it because it gives Moscow leverage. It strengthens Russia's role in the global nuclear fuel supply chain. It positions Russia as a central player in any post-conflict Middle East framework. And from Washington's perspective, handing that kind of strategic advantage to Moscow is a serious concern. That skepticism is not irrational. It's grounded in real geopolitical competition. But here's the critical question: not whether Russia benefits, but whether the alternative is better. Because the alternative is what we are seeing right now: a prolonged blockade, a ceasefire that exists more on paper than in reality, rising tensions in critical trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz, Elevated oil prices that ripple through global markets and hit consumers directly, and most importantly, Iran's enriched uranium still sitting inside Iran, unchanged, unresolved, and increasingly central to the crisis. When you compare those outcomes, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism starts to look heavier than the benefit of denying Moscow additional influence. That's the calculation that was made and rejected. And that rejection is exactly why Iraqi is in St. Petersburg today, while Washington is effectively waiting for a different solution to appear. Now, looking forward, the next phase of this story becomes even more important. What's likely happening behind closed doors right now is not abstract discussion, but refinement. Russia is expected to present a more detailed, updated version of its uranium custody proposal, more specific than earlier versions. This would likely include clear timelines for transfer, defined storage conditions, structured IEA oversight, and most crucially, explicit limitations on what Russia can do with the material once it has it. That last part is the heart of the American objection. Concerns about resale, reprocessing, and market leverage. If this updated proposal includes binding guarantees, real constraints that prevent Russia from turning Iran's uranium into a geopolitical asset without broader consent, then the core U.S. concern is at least partially addressed. From there, the process becomes diplomatic transmission. Arachi carries the framework back to Thran. It moves through regional intermediaries. It eventually lands back on Washington's desk. And at that point, the decision becomes unavoidable. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If it's accepted, the implications are immediate. The uranium issue, the 99%, is resolved. Pressure on global trade routes eases. The pathway to ending the conflict opens. But if it's rejected again, the consequences are just as clear. The conflict continues, and the diplomatic record begins to tell a very specific story. Iran signaled willingness. Russia provided a mechanism, and the United States declined twice. That narrative matters. It shapes alliances, influences global perception, and affects how future negotiations are framed. And then there's China, quiet but far from absent. Wang Yi and Beijing have taken a position of strategic silence. No public statements, no visible pressure, no overt alignment in today's headlines. But behind that silence is influence. China continues to purchase Iranian oil, providing Tehran with economic breathing room. It has already engaged in discussions with Russia and the IAEA on Iran's nuclear issue. It operates as a stabilizing force for Iran, not by speaking loudly, but by ensuring Iran has the capacity to wait. In many ways, China is shaping the environment without stepping into the spotlight. It's present without appearing present. And that quiet presence is what allows Iran to sit in St. Petersburg today, engaging with Russia instead of rushing to respond to Washington. Which brings us back to the simplest, most revealing image of this entire situation. Donald Trump said there is a phone, a line of communication, a path forward. But that phone hasn't rung. Instead, Iraqi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the one country that needs that mechanism the most has yet to accept it. Now, let me add one more layer because this might be the most important piece of the entire puzzle, and it goes far beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before this conflict escalated, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This wasn't a symbolic handshake. It was one of the most comprehensive bilateral frameworks either country has entered into